Welcome to session 109. Our difficult topic for this session is death notification and family assistance. And Josh, in my whole career, my master's program, all my education, until I started working with the ACC and started some of our trainings, I had never been trained or taught how to do a death notification.
Yeah, and the importance of it is huge, because you're telling somebody the loss of a loved one, about the loss of a loved one, and you have no idea how this person's going to handle it or how they're going to respond. And so as a crisis responder, you'd hope that you'd never have to do this, but it does come up. If you are a crisis responder, there's a chance you may have to. And to know the protocol, to know how to do it, to know how to handle death notification is so important.
It is so important because, Josh, if this is done well, it can help a person begin to heal. If it's done poorly, it adds all those secondary wounds. Finding out about such a tragedy in a way that isn't handled well, or with dignity or grace or love, makes a bad thing even harder. Our instructor for this session, Greg Young, has done hundreds or more death notifications. He's worked with state police. He has written articles for police officers and done trainings on how to do a death notification. So we've got a very, very skilled professional who has wisdom, experience, and a compassionate spirit about doing death notification. He's going to give you step by step the protocols, exactly what to do and not to do. So in the unfortunate event that you are called on to either by yourself or as a part of a team, be a part of a death notification, you will have the skills and knowledge to do that in the best way possible. Let's go now to Greg Young.
And I'm the chaplain and debriefer for the Germantown, Wisconsin Police Department. I'm also a trainer in law enforcement for Law Enforcement Training Agency. And I would like to talk to crisis responders today in this particular presentation about making death notifications, something you may be called upon to do, especially following a large-scale disaster. Now, making compassionate death notifications to the next of kin following a sudden death or a large crisis is one of the most difficult things, as you can imagine, that you possibly might ever have to do. And very few people who are called upon to make these notifications actually have much of any training at all. And I can't think of something any more difficult to do than this. So I think it's incumbent upon us to actually pick up the training that we can. So what we're going to be covering in this presentation is you're going to be learning how to make a compassionate death notification. You're going to learn crisis communication techniques and what I call best practices and protocols. And also what is helpful to say and what cliches, and including God cliches, that we should avoid. Now, my objectives for you for this particular course are this: that you will have an enhanced awareness of the emotional hazards of crisis work. This is a crisis situation, a critical incident, and it is very stressful. And the second is that you develop better crisis communication tools. So we're going to unpack that toolbox and take a look at those tools. Number three, that you'll become familiar with what are really best practices, protocols in making a death notification if you're called upon to make that. And number four, that you can make a compassionate and a thorough death notification. As crisis responders to both large and small-scale disasters where people tragically die, following 9/11, a number of people were having to make death notifications, so you never know when you're going to be called upon to do that. And making death notification is among one of the most difficult tasks that any of us could ever be asked to do. People who we notify, their lives are going to be turned upside down, and it's going to create an emotional firestorm. And those of us who are called upon to make death notifications know that we really only get one opportunity to get it right. And often the next of kin that we are notifying will remember very specific things. They'll remember how perhaps we stumbled over words, or perhaps how we emotionally struggled ourselves in making the notification. They're going to remember and have a freeze frame of a number of specific things about us. I'd like to open with a story. I've made many death notifications, unfortunately, over my career. But one fairly recently sticks out in my mind. Last fall, there was a young woman at the age of she was 35 years of age, and she had left her husband at home with her two kids, a 3-year-old boy and a 5-year-old girl. And she'd gone up into northern Wisconsin to the North Woods to ride on four-wheelers on trails, which they like to do. But they were going from bar to bar, and she had drank too much alcohol. And she lost control of her four-wheeler, ran into a tree, and she was killed. And so I was called into the department to make a death notification. And I was assigned a young officer who had been with the department for about 2 years. And so when I was coupled up with him, one of the first things I did, which is important I think for you to do if you're ever called upon to do this, was I asked him if he had ever made a death notification before. And he kind of gulped and said, no, I've never made a death notification. But he says, well, I guess there's always a first time. So we're riding in a squad car and we're driving up to the residence, trying to find the proper residence. And as we come up there, you know, I talked to him about what role, and he said, I'm going to follow your lead, man, whatever it is you want to do. So we pull up, it's about dusk, and sometimes you almost pray that the family has already gotten word some other way. But really that is not a best practice. So we pull up, and we can see in the picture window in the living room, Dad's sitting in his recliner watching a ball game, and the kids are playing gleefully in the living room. And as we're walking up the driveway, up to the sidewalk and to knock on the door, I said to the young officer, I said, what we're about to do is going to turn their lives upside down forever. We're going to change their lives. And so it was an indeed emotional firestorm. Now, why do we deal with this? We deal with this because making death notifications is a very difficult subject. And in 2005, according to some statistics, about 115 people die every day in automobile accidents in this country. According to Department of Justice Uniform Reporting Code, 440 people approximately are killed or murdered each week. And one person takes his or her own life every 15.2 minutes. I teach a course on suicide, and it used to be every 16.1 minutes, but in more recent years, that number and the frequency has increased. Number 4, add to that every person who perishes from other sudden death methods, be it a heart attack, a stroke, drowning, recreational accidents, or work-related accidents, and simply become aware that it is indeed a very big problem. Now, perhaps you know somebody who died a sudden death, and there was a death notification. And perhaps you yourself were the recipient of a death notification. If indeed this was the case, I'm sorry for your loss. I really am. There is a need. Most families in which someone was killed will say that the most traumatic moment in their entire life was the moment when somebody knocked on their door and made a death notification of their loved one. They still remember that notification, you know, and they will remember it the rest of their lives. And those of us who are required to make death notifications remember those events, you know, for the rest of our lives. I remember and can recall every death notification I have ever made. Now, there's little training out there to prepare those of us who might make death notifications. Many of the law enforcement, which make a lot of them, or fire, EMS personnel, coroners, medical examiners, often don't receive much training in how to make a death notification. It's estimated that about 1/3 of all death notifications are made by these professionals or crisis responders and chaplains. When I teach this course, and I teach a course like this and others at several community colleges around the Midwest and a number of different agencies, including the FBI, and I always ask for a show of hands for those who have had any training about making death notifications. And even though it's anecdotal, less than 25% of the people hold up their hands, and then I poll them and ask them, you know, what kind of training they received, and most of them say, well, it's about a 10 or 15 minute segment as a part of something else. So indeed, you know, there is really, really very little training out there, and it's important, I think, that we will learn. So we're going to cover some things in the next following steps. The first thing I would submit to you is that the selection of the notifier is very important. There are a number of apprehensions. It's not for everybody. That much I would say. The first point is this. One of the apprehensions is that people feel untrained or unprepared. I remember the first time I made a notification, I had had all kinds of training and came fresh from yet another training and had done a lot of research. But yet I didn't feel prepared. So you're always going to be an incredibly difficult task, and you're never going to feel prepared for something like that. The second point is under apprehensions is that you might over-identify with the victim's family. For instance, if you have children who are about the same age of, say, a child that has died that you're having to notify parents about, understandably, that's going to be more difficult for you, and that's something you need to keep in consideration. Number 3, personal vulnerability. If you're going through a number of different things, like a divorce, if you've gone through the death of a loved one in your immediate family, It's going to impact you, and maybe perhaps now you have too much on your plate and you shouldn't be making that notification. And 4, and equally important, is a fear of the reaction of those who are being notified. They could be emotional and very violent reactions are sometimes a normal reaction to an abnormal event. Now, the second piece of the selection of the notifier is an assessment piece. I often give to, when I teach a full course in making death notifications, it's a personal stress inventory. It's called the Holmes-Rahe Personal Stress Inventory, and it's got like 40 or 50 different questions that it asks you. Are you going through divorce? Have you death of a loved one, loss of a pet, any number of things. And of course, then you tally up your score, and the higher your score, the more susceptible you are to stress-related illness. Now, what I would submit to those of you, say if you're a crisis responder, you're working a part of a team, that whoever is the supervisor, the head of that team, be it chaplains or whatever the case may be, that you keep that in mind and be cognizant of the fact if somebody has had a lot of stuff going on in their life, perhaps they shouldn't be making a death notification if you're called upon to do so. It may be too close to home. A story I'd like to tell you. My first chief in my police department, before I actually became a chaplain, but I was a pastor in the community at the time. There was a guy named Frank, and he was like everybody's grandpa. He had the half glasses and everything, and he was a very kindly man. Near the end of Frank's tenure as police chief, there was a death of a little boy, 3 years old, that was actually murdered by a young man who had to get back at his girlfriend. They had the child between them. The child was 3 years old. He actually had buried this child alive off a park and ride in my community. And so he finally confessed to what he did, and the chief and 3 other officers responded. He took them out to the scene, and they're on their hands and knees, kind of just digging the dirt away. And the chief, the first thing he comes in contact with when they come in contact with the child was this curly strawberry blonde hair. He had a grandchild that was about 3 years old and had strawberry blonde hair. Well, at an unconscious level, we can talk about transference and countertransference issues, but really that isn't within the purview of this training, of this course. But needless to say that he lost it. And we talked about that. And it wasn't long after that he retired. So it may be too close to home, and that's an important factor to remember. The timing may not be right for the notifier. If you've got a lot on your plate, it may not be a good time. And so that's another factor. And the third point under the assessment is that the notifier should be comfortable under the best of circumstances in talking to people that he or she doesn't know. If you're an extrovert and you're comfortable talking to people, strangers you don't know, that's an important thing, then perhaps you would be better suited to making a death notification. But if you're an introvert and you're not comfortable talking to people, strangers, perhaps it may not be your cup of tea. But never mind that. There are other ways in which you can minister. You don't necessarily have to make the notification. Be some follow-up. So that's important to remember. Now, a really stress notifier would not be a good notifier. As we've talked about, the stress inventory and some of those kinds of things, because a death notification is an incredibly stressful event. You might be distracted if you're really stressed. You might have a strong emotional reaction. I do a lot of disaster deployment as well, and had members of teams that weren't screened properly, and sometimes which they have had they've actually gone down to do the disaster response for their own healing. And because of that, they ended up being ministered to more by the people they'd gone down to minister to in the first place than they were able to help. So that's an important piece to remember. Now, the next point that I would like to talk about are the reactions that people have to making a death notification. First is denial. No, it can't be. Second is shock. The third is numbness. And the fourth is fight, flight, or freeze. And any of these in particular can create, that 1,000-yard stare that we talk about with the traumatized individual. FYI, you might want to know that young men between the ages of 17 and 35 are the most likely age group to take a swing at you as the messenger of making a death notification, just because you're bearing bad news. Young people also have a tendency upon hearing bad news and leaving the place that they are. One of the things it's real important for you to do and remember is that if that is indeed the case, if they leave the residence, if it's a residence, and you're making notification, that you go in twos. And we're going to talk a little bit later about the importance of going in pairs. Go in twos so that one of you can follow up with the young person just to make sure they aren't harming themselves, that they're okay. Intense emotional reactions, obviously, to a death notification are normal reactions to an abnormal event, and we need to remember that. Now, the moment of notification is, number one, probably the most traumatic moment in the lives of those people that you're notifying, and it can be the focus of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms that develop later. One of the things I'm going to be talking about a little bit later in the presentation is the mental status exam that you might want to administer to people. It is real important if you're in a community, if you've given the luxury and you have to make a death notification, that you or some of your team members can do follow-up so that you can assess and refer if you need to. The second point under this is that trauma can be made worse by how they are notified and what happens immediately after they're notified. Now, a little later on, I'm going to tell you a story about some really bad examples of this and how it really traumatized individuals. Many family members will remember a very narrow focus. It's almost like looking through a tunnel, having tunnel vision. Word, sight, smell of the notification that's been made. And people will have a very difficult time thinking clearly. Blood, as you probably know from some of your other trainings, flows when a person is in the midst of trauma or in the midst of a crisis, flows from the reasoning portions of our brain to the major muscle groups to prepare us for fight, flight, or freeze. And it's real important to remember that. And it also flows to the more primitive portions of the brain. An example of that is, and the reason we want to do that is because you want to speak in very concrete language, because a person is not able to reason very well. There was a woman who was going through a divorce with her husband in my community. And her husband had lost yet another job due to his drinking. She had a 5-year-old boy and a 7-year-old girl. And after he had the news upon losing this last job, it was in the fall one year. She says to him, I need to sort through some things. I don't know if I can stay married to you. Took the kids, went down to see her sister and her dad down in Iowa. And while they're down there, you know, she took the kids through a corn maze. It was a beautiful fall weekend. On the way home, she calls her husband, doesn't answer the phone after she stops to get gas. Arrives home with the kids, comes into their condominium, and notices that he is still alive. He's sitting there on the bed with a .44 loaded Magnum and a half-drunk bottle of Bacardi's. She takes the gun, she says, I can't believe you were stupid enough to do something like this. Takes the gun, puts it back in his dresser, leaves the room, and then she proceeds to tell the kids as she's on her way out to the car to get the rest of their luggage, go in and see Dad. Dad is really kind of depressed right now, and you know, he could really use some comfort. So the little girl and the little boy go into the bedroom where Dad is. And Dad says, come here, I love you very much. Remember that, Dad will always love you. Daddy's kind of tired right now. Would you mind, turning out the light and closing the door and leaving? So you probably know where this story's going, unfortunately. So the kids go out, they turn out the light, close the door. And the minute they do that, they're still in the hallway. Dad has taken the gun, he shot himself in the head, killed himself. The kids are the first two inside. The little girl's upset, she wets herself, and the little boy is just all over the place. Worked with him all night. But I remember when I was called to the scene, we do something real important to do in this kind of trauma work, is to do what we kind of an emotional triage. And so as I came up to the scene, everybody was outside because the house was being treated as a crime scene, and so nobody was admitted into the scene. So notice the kids somebody was working with the kids, a counselor was working with the kids, but I noticed Mom was easy to identify, the wife. She's covered with blood, she's covered with gore, and she's standing there, kind of just with that 1,000-yard stare going. And so I come up to her, and we'll call her Chris. And she says, she looks at me, and the first thing she says after the introduction, she says, they told me he was gone. Where did he go? Now, you might think at first glance that, she should know. She's covered with blood and gore. She'd gone in to cradle him, and she'd cried over him. But because she was traumatized and blood had flowed away from the reasoning portions of her brain, she didn't get it. And I took her by the shoulders, and I said, honey, I'm really sorry to tell you this, but your husband is dead. he's dead. And at that point, she started pounding on me and screaming and crying and pounding on the walls. And it really ultimately wasn't until that time that she actually had gotten a death notification, even though somebody had told her, even though she knew he was dead, she had seen him. So it's real important to speak in concrete language. That's an important piece to remember. Now, notifications elicit strong emotional reactions. It's real important, I think, when people, because they'll feel embarrassed once they calm down, you go through the emotional firestorm with them, they'll calm down. It's real important to tell them when they're embarrassed, you must really think I'm nuts or something, that their reactions are normal reactions to an abnormal event. This woman indeed did apologize to me, and I assured her that her reaction was very understandable. Very normal reaction to an abnormal event. And then we helped clean her up and kind of, see where we could go from there to help her. Now, the next piece that we're going to learn, we're going to get into something called crisis communication techniques. Tools in a tool bag, hopefully that will be helpful. I teach this course at a number of community colleges. And the first piece that I would like for us to cover are some basic mirroring techniques. First, body mirroring. If it's at all possible, and we'll get into best practices later on, it's best to let a person know is to mirror their body language. Because people, sometimes if you ask them to sit down, and sometimes it's important to get them to sit down, but if they're emotionally distraught, they don't want to sit down. So whatever it is you need to do, you need to kind of mirror their body language, but you need to be as relaxed as possible. And with men, I often suggest something in crisis communications that we call the L or the V stance. Never square up with a man within their personal space, and because that feels very confrontational. And what you want to do is you want to mirror their body language, and as much as is appropriate and comfortable, you want to make good eye contact. The second piece in this toolbox is this. Good Lord gave us two of these. You listen, you listen, you listen. And for moments of silence, like a flower is traumatized in a storm, it'll close up on itself. Human beings are the same way in the midst of trauma and crisis. They'll eventually open up if you are safe to them. So it's real important that we be safe to them. So tolerate repetition, because a lot of times people will give you the story, and then they'll feel a need to tell you the story again and again and again if you're there with any length of time. So that's real important. The third piece is verbal mirroring. Well, in various trainings that you've had, critical incident stress management, whatever the case may be, there are a number of different mirroring techniques, but I'm only really going to lift up, I think, one that I think is especially helpful in making death notification, and that's called a summary paraphrase, where you mirror back in your own words a portion of what you hear them say, in your own words. You don't want to parrot back the same words you hear them say, because they may actually be more upset. You may have an empathic break, and they may say, "You sound like a parrot." For instance, an example that I would use. He just called me on the phone an hour ago. And in your own words, you might say something like, "You just talked to him." It's that simple. It really is. Why do we do that? Because people need to have validated what they're saying, and that can be a very powerful tool. Now, the next tool that I'd like to share is something called a reflection of emotion that hostage negotiators sometimes use in law enforcement. What you do is you attempt to validate the emotional state or feeling that the person is going through. And what you do is it helps to build empathy and rapport with the person. You seem angry, for example. And speaking of that, when I was in graduate school in the Twin Cities, WCCO Television in Minneapolis used to have a series of town hall programs that followed the 10 o'clock news. And they would always have figures, guests around a controversial topic that would create a lot of fireworks. In one particular episode, where I saw this particular tool most powerfully demonstrated, was Pat Miles was the anchor of the 10 o'clock news at that time. And right after the news, she hosted, and the primary guest was a gentleman who was a pastor in a church. It was a white supremacist church called the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord. And they had seated around that conference room table, they had Jewish people, they had Native American people, they had African American people, they had Muslim people, they had people from lots of different persuasions of every particular group that he might be diametrically opposed to. So as she had done his introduction, and barely had she gotten through his introduction, she's sitting at the head of the table and he's at the corner. And as she's doing that, he launches into a tirade. He's leaning over the table and he's looking square in the eyes of the people gathered around the table, and he's just, all this vitriol and this hatred is coming out. And she couldn't take it after a couple, 3 minutes of this stuff coming out of him. And she leans over the table, the moderator does, and she says, "Why are you so angry?" My friends, never have I seen that tool more powerfully displayed, because for the next 2 minutes, next 3 minutes, 5 minutes, he couldn't say a word. He was totally diffused. She diffused the situation. And he was never the same for the rest of that 1 hour program. And the other people were finally given a chance to catch their breath, and although they were upset, they were much kinder in response to him than he had been up to that point. That is called a reflection of emotion, a very powerful tool. And the next one I would like to state is something called silence. Now, don't feel a need that you have to say to somebody, that there are magical words that you can say to make them feel better. Because a lot of times you come across a traumatized person, and a person in a death notification is indeed somebody who is incredibly traumatized. They may not feel like talking at all, and they may be upset if you intrude, on whatever their thoughts may happen to be. Sometimes just sitting down, mirroring their body language, being with them can be the most powerful thing that you can do. And they may remember your kindness in allowing them that space and that silence more than any words you could ever say at that time. Another thing, just as we're leaving this particular aspect, would be to remember to watch their body language. Because sometimes if you're working with somebody, if they've got the fidgeting hands or the clenched jaw, or they have exaggerated movements, or whatever the case may be. But sometimes people will cross their arms, and some people that's just a comfortable, relaxed position. But sometimes people will do that because they'll want to close themselves off, and they're kind of giving you that signal, or they'll break eye contact. In that particular case, sometimes people will, if you're working with them, you feel safe and comfortable, they may open up to you. But you get to something that they're not quite as comfortable with, you'll find them kind of closing off on themselves. Pay attention to these things, kind of file them away. Real important things. The next point is to remember avoiding certain cliches. For instance, and you may have been guilty, I think at some point in our life, most of us are guilty of this. Don't say, "I know how you feel. Time heals all wounds. You'll get over it someday. He was at the wrong place at the wrong time. You can always find somebody worse off than you." Now, I'm going to come back just momentarily to the "I know how you feel" thing. You may have justifiably gone through a similar experience, but at the moment when you are notifying somebody, in the midst of that crisis and that acute phase, is not a time to be telling somebody that, you know how they feel, because we don't really know how they feel. We aren't walking in their shoes. They might invite us to take that journey with them. And also at the time of notification, it's important to avoid what I call God cliches. We're all godly people, I would think. But during the time of notification, sometimes saying things like this, I would submit to you, are not helpful. God must have needed him or her more than you did. God never gives us more than we can handle. It must have been his time. Someday you'll understand. That last one, indeed, I like to believe that, in the hereafter, that God will have much more clarity and the scales will fall from our eyes. But these are not helpful things to say to people who are traumatized when they've just learned that, say, their 17-year-old child is dead. Next point is be careful in the use of touch. Now, I'd like to say a little bit more about that, because we're living in an increasingly multicultural world, and we have to be really careful in the use of touch. Don't, for instance, if you have a Hmong population, in the church where I'm a pastor, part-time small church, we have a Hmong congregation, a Hmong Alliance Church, that worships in the afternoon. And one of the things, there's an ancient belief among the Hmong people, even though they may be practicing Christians, that you don't pat the head or rub the head of a child or an elderly person, or any Hmong person for that matter, because there's an ancient belief in the Hmong culture that the most sacred part of the human body is the head, because within the head resides the human soul. And for a stranger especially to touch the head of someone, but sometimes when we see kids, it's just kind of a pat of endearment that we give them. They will, it can be very upsetting, because that can jeopardize their soul. If you're working with a Muslim person, because you never know, called upon in a crisis situation, that you might be called upon to work with with Muslim people. Never use your left hand if you're going to be making points of contact. Why? Because the left hand is unclean in the Muslim culture. Also, never have a man work with a woman if it's a Muslim woman. Try to make sure with your crisis teams that you have a person who are same sex. And lastly, I want to talk a moment about eye contact. We assume that everybody makes good eye contact. Among some of the Southeast Asian cultures and among some Native American populations and cultures, it is a sign of disrespect to maintain too much eye contact. So if you find a person that you're working with, if you're making a notification, break eye contact with, it may or may not mean something, but you might want to file it away, especially if there's some cultural differences. Important things to keep in mind. Now, the last thing I would say in all of this, as we finish up this particular section on crisis communication techniques, is this. Simply slow it down and soften it up. When we're dealing with somebody in crisis, it's crucial that we slow everything down, that we talk slower and calmer with as much warmth and softness as we possibly can. Don't make exaggerated body movements. Make good eye contact as much as is appropriate or comfortable. Allow for pauses in a conversation. You see, people in distress, they will key off what they experience us to be. So, we need God to be our source of strength, and help calm us. And I always ask for God's calming presence to be that rock for me so that I can be calm for other people. But you ever notice, though, when we have an adrenaline dump and knocking on somebody's door and you're going to make a death notification, if you're not having an adrenaline dump, you're probably not human, shouldn't probably be making the notification. But with an adrenaline dump, sometimes when we get excited with that, our voices, we speak more rapidly and our voices take on a higher pitch. So it's important to really consciously make an effort to try to slow it down and soften it up. Real important. Best practices now. Going into best practices, go. Quite simply, go. Don't make a notification via phone to next of kin if you possibly can. Gather as much information as you possibly can. Make sure you have the correct address. Make sure you have the name of the deceased, the loved one, correct, so that you can make a proper notification. The second point is be certain of the identity of the deceased and get the name right. There were two sons. A family had two sons that were about 2 years apart in age. And one of the things that happened, it turned out later to be a suicide, but we ended up making a death notification on the suicide. A 17-year-old young man, on a 1-year anniversary of the death of his friend, he had a taped picture of his friend, dashboard of his car, and he drank a bunch of alcohol, and he drove recklessly and ran into a tree, and was thrown from the vehicle and was killed immediately. And so when we come to the scene, what we find is that the young man, he'd had $2 crumpled up in his pocket. He had no wallet. He had no identification whatsoever. And so the investigating officer, myself, the medical examiner, and the police chief were going to make this a notification. Now, that is not a best practice. I would submit to you that if 2 is good, more is not better. 2 is best, but in this particular case, because it was the difficulty of the circumstances, we needed to do it. The car was traced back to Dad, so we went to the house, and the officer who was examining the scene asked me, how should I go about doing this? And I said, we need to determine who the deceased is to make sure we have the name right. Names have gotten confused, and you don't want to traumatize people by getting, if you have 2 kids about the same age or 2 loved ones about the same age, you want to make sure you have the identity correct. That's real important. Number 3 is give EMS a heads up whenever you're making a notification, especially to elderly people, because the shock of a death notification can actually cause people to die, have heart attacks and strokes. A tragic example of that was an elderly grandfather was given a phone notification that his granddaughter had died tragically in a horrible bus accident a number of years ago in Florida. And he was notified over the telephone. And he was found a few days later because nobody had seen him at his regular social gatherings, but he was found dead in the house. He'd already hung up the phone, so it's real important, and we'll talk a little more about that later. Next thing to do is what not to do. Bad examples. As I say, I teach this course in a number of different places, and I garner a number of different stories out there. In one in particular, there was a Post-it note that was left from a sheriff's department. A family was not home. Mom and dad were at work, and they tried to find mom and dad, and rather find them at the place of work and make a notification there that their son had hung himself. And they had left a Post-it note on the front door of the house with the phone number for the sheriff's department, and if they had any questions at all, to give them a call. I would suggest to you that that was probably traumatizing in itself. In one example that I had that I remember vividly, I teach a number of different venues, and I was teaching at a sheriff's department, was hosting an event that there were quite a few people gathered for this particular training. And there were 10 different agencies, law enforcement agencies represented. And I got near the end of the training, going through the best practices and those kinds of things, and a sheriff's deputy raises his hand and says, I have a sergeant, he's now retired, who did everything by the book, these best practices that you talked about. And he, but just as he was leaving, and by the way, it happened to be a young person who was killed in an automobile accident that they were notifying, he turns to the boy's parents and he says, "What would you like me to do with the carcass?" Now, ladies and gentlemen, think how you might receive that news upon the death of your loved one. Sometimes police will do things and say things to protect themselves. We train them not to try to use that kind of language, but that was incredibly traumatizing. Indeed it was. Another thing I would suggest is a best practice is don't relay information about the deceased or the incident over the radio. If you are using ham radio, a lot of times our disaster teams will use ham radio or other CB radios, those kinds of things. Do not relay over the public airwaves information about the deceased any more than you have to, because people can pick up on that. Sometimes family members can pick up on that, and it's always a race against time. So you go, you don't call. It's a race against time. A man in my community in Germantown was married to a woman. They had a wonderful marriage of 42 years. And his wife had left a note on the kitchen table and said, honey, I'm going to be gone for about 15 minutes, and I'm going to be at the store getting a gift for a coworker at the local Syndics grocery store. Well, an hour and a half later, she hasn't come home, and the husband's kind of distraught. Where is she? And he heard sirens, so he gets in his car and goes a mile up the road where there was an accident. He didn't know that his wife had died of cerebral aneurysm and run into another automobile, causing an accident. Fortunately, the other parties were not injured. Unfortunately, she was killed actually before the actual impact of the injury. But he was trying to get into the scene, and he could, but he couldn't see what car it was, but he was concerned about his wife. And our police department said, go home, we'll let you know. They call me into our dispatch center. I go into dispatch center, and the husband's on the phone, and he's distraught. And he's talking to the 911 dispatcher, and she hands me the phone and says, here, it's the husband. You take the call. Well, I knew the minute I introduced myself as a chaplain, and the minute that I started to tell him what had happened, I was going to have to make a notification over the phone, which is not a best practice. So I introduced myself to him, and of course then he gets very, very upset, starts screaming, and I thought he was going to drop the phone, and I asked him if he was alone and if he was sitting down, and of course he wasn't, and he was alone. So I was very concerned. He screams, he drops the phone, and I tell the dispatcher, I said, I want another officer there to meet me at that residence stat. We need to be there. We need to respond to this because we don't want to make sure he harms himself, that he's going to be okay, that he doesn't die of a heart attack or something like that himself. We go to the house, and he has a gun set up in the living room. Find out later that it was not a gun they used for that, but to shoot at rodents. So, but we didn't know. He might have reached for that gun, and we were able to stabilize him. So it's real important. It's a race against time. He could have found out some other way. If it's a notification at a place of work, and sometimes we make a notification, especially in large-scale disaster at a place of work, first talk to the supervisor. and give them as much information as you need to, but no more. And ask if there's any private space. And when I've had to make notifications like this, they have just gone out of their way just to move heaven and earth in order to provide space. And also another best practice that's not in the notes is to find out if there's a family, a friend or something, a coworker that they're close to who can transport them. Real important. Go in pairs. That is another best practice. 2 police officers. We're trying to find a residence. They were given a teletype of death. Next of kin happened to be in our community. And they were so intent on finding the address that they hadn't discussed among themselves in pairs as to who is going to say what words. There are certain things you need to say. And so they got to the door and they're pounding on the door. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. And they're ringing the doorbell. And what they find was that somebody turns on the light. And they're standing there, the husband and wife, and they're disheveled. See 2 officers. They're understandably, they're anxious. What's going on? What's happened? And they kind of look at each other. No, you tell them. No, you tell them. And they hadn't decided among themselves who was going to play what role. So that's real important. Also, do not leave them alone. Never leave them alone. Find out if they have a pastor, if they have clergy, what their support system is. When you're there, do not leave until you're able to connect them with some other loved one that can come and help be there and be a source of strength for them. The next point I would like to make is to present credentials. If you go as a crisis responder, it's real important that you provide some credentials, some sort of a lanyard. Most of the organizations that we work with do provide some sort of credentials, and that's real important. You want to be safe to them, so it's important that you have that credibility. The next point is that ask the next of kin if you can come inside. It's important that we be invited inside if at all possible, because for safety reasons, you want to make sure, number one, you want to make it personal as you possibly can. But number 2, they may harm themselves, and we want to make sure they're okay. Now, if they are mistrusting for whatever reason, you may have to make a notification through the door. I've had to do that. But ask to be invited inside if you possibly can. And then if you can, ask the next of kin to sit down and make sure that they are the next of kin. Never notify children. What I'm finding, the more that I do this though, a lot of people do not want to sit down because they've had an adrenaline dump. And they want you in some way to tell them what's happening. They're going to be standing in your face. Be ready to catch them because people do collapse. Now, everything we've done up to this point is to come to these words. And it's called saying the dreaded words. Take a deep breath, say a prayer to yourself, and say to yourself and say, God, give me the strength to be calm. And as slowly and as directly, with as much warmth as compassion as you can possibly say it, say something like this. I'm afraid that I have some very bad news for you. Pause. Give them a chance to ramp up, for them to psychologically prepare themselves. Name, use the first name, make sure you have the name right, has been involved in a serious automobile accident, and he or she has died. Pause again briefly. I'm really, really sorry. They did everything that they possibly could to save him or her. I'm truly sorry for your loss. Now, you may not be able to get all those words out. Sometimes you do, and sometimes you're not able to. And you can make your own variation of that, but make it your own words, but be sure to say it slowly, calmly, with as much compassion as you possibly can. Saying you're sorry expresses emotion. It shows that you're human. Continue to use the word dead and died for the reasons that I had explained already throughout the ongoing conversation. And also continue to use the victim's name, especially their first name, because you'll make it personal. If it's a suicide, and I've been called to way too many suicides, don't say it was a successful suicide. Never say that. Rather say something like, he or she took his or her own life. Now, the next thing I would like to talk about is something that can be helpful to people once they've gone through the emotional firestorm and you're working with them. It's called task empowerment. Something I have found is kind of helpful because people are powerless. When you've notified them, you've pulled the rug out from underneath their lives, and their lives will never be quite the same again. And some examples of what I call task empowerment, are kind of what it sounds like. Can you give me some more information, or can you begin to tell me about so-and-so? Make them come alive. They may not feel like talking about that. Can you put on a pot of coffee? Little things like that, those little baby steps they can begin to take. Do you want to make some phone calls? because inevitably they're going to have to make calls, or if they can't, offer to make calls for them, because that would begin to connect them with people. These things I like to call task empowerment. Be their advocate. You never know. Their need to know is paramount. They're going to have questions, tons of questions that you can't answer, some of which you can. Be prepared. They may want to know, they might want to have access to the crime report or an autopsy report or a toxicology report, things that might better indicate what happened to the person. Help be their advocate, but also give them a heads up and let them know that, obtaining these things can take some time. So it's real important, their need to know. And one final thing to all of this is, if they ask you a question and you say, well, I'll find out for you. I don't know the answer to that, but I will find out for you. Be sure and follow up, because that's real important. You want to establish and build trust. Now, the next section I would like to talk about briefly is something that's very difficult for us to talk about, and that's called viewing the body. A lot of times I'm finding, the more that I do this, and I've trained literally hundreds of law enforcement officers and medical examiners, is that sometimes a loved one, especially if it's a mother and a child, will want to have some contact with the body. And sometimes you can't always promise or can achieve that. But give them an informed choice. The body was really pretty badly beat up, or you use your own kind words. It's difficult to find words if a body has been mutilated. But sometimes, even if a body is shrouded, if you can give them an opportunity for contact with a hand, that means an awful lot to them. So there was a young man who committed suicide in my community. He was 17 years old, lived with his mom. Dad was out of the scene. He'd worked and lived in another part of the city, had not been a part of the young man's life very much. And so he comes storming into the house where he'd committed suicide, in the basement of the house. And he's getting ready to storm down into the scene. It's being treated as a crime scene. And I had to intervene, because he said, I want to see his body. I'm not leaving until I see his body. And he said this several times, and I kept working with him. Finally, I talked to the medical examiner and the chief of police, and I said, would it be possible, when you bring the card up, when you're done, before you go back to your office or take him to the funeral home, whether or not I could possibly, we could have a moment of prayer or something with him. And so I told the fellow what we planned to do, and of course they said yeah, and he said, but I'm not leaving until I touch his body. And I told him he wouldn't be able to do that. So touched his body. So they brought the card up, and we gathered around it, and I said, you can put your hands on the bag, because the body was bagged. And we had a prayer, and he turned and said thank you to me. So, something to keep in mind is that you can be their advocate this way. And what are survivor needs? They need to vent their emotions. They need a calm, stabilizing presence that you can provide. They need help in restoring control. They need help in being prepared for what to expect next. For instance, you can tell them, a medical examiner may be asking them questions, or they may be thinking of a funeral home, because in a sudden death, often a young one, you don't really have that opportunity. What are some helpful things to say? Say, I'm sorry. They did everything they possibly could. It's harder than most people think. Number 3, is there something else you would like to ask me or talk to me about? And number 4, I will check back with you tomorrow and see if there's anything else I can do for you. And be sure and follow up. Sometimes after a funeral is a good time. What to do? Answer questions as honestly as you possibly can. Offer to help make calls. Don't leave them alone. Let the survivors know you care. Please do follow up if it's at all possible. Remember, in time, in person, in pairs, in simple language, with compassion. A piece I would like to add here in the closing moments is, and I'm just going to speak about it briefly, and that is something called the C3 mental status exam that we use in critical incident stress management. And briefly, you look at speech, emotion, appearance, alertness, and their activity level. And you look at the amplitude and quality. Over time, does that change? So you have a baseline. Their emotion, is there a lack of affect? Or several days later, are they still upset? Their appearance, are they still unkempt several days later? Their alertness level, has that not changed at all from when you notified them? Or their activity level? Are their facial expressions, do they seem kind of like non-responsive, or just like, do they have a 1,000-yard stare? If you sense any of these things at all going on with them, you might want to intervene and say, I'd like for you to talk to so-and-so. That's real important. Just kind of get this checked out. We want to make sure you're okay. Finally, debrief. Now, I'm not talking about a 7-step formal debriefing like we do in critical incident stress management. But after the notification, be sure and take the time to talk about the notification. Find a place to talk about what was the worst thing about this particular experience, and what do you feel went well? I mean, it seems like a strange thing to say about a death notification, but what do you feel worked and didn't work? But also check and see how each of you is doing. With that young officer that I talked about earlier in one of my little scenarios, I checked in with him to see how he was doing, and he was doing okay. The last thing, because you are crisis responders, please, please, please take care of yourself. You've had an adrenaline dump, a very stressful incident. Take care of yourself. Be sure and hydrate, drink lots of water, find exercise, walk, whatever it is you do, find some sort of an exercise that you need to do. Talk to people you trust, pray, meditate, and worship, because God gives us the strength. Eat healthy. In conclusion, please, ladies and gentlemen, remember that if you're called upon to make a death notification, you are performing a very difficult task. And you're providing most valuable, albeit difficult, ministry. Know that God goes with you each and every step of the way. God will give you the courage. God will give you the compassion. God will give you the wisdom to care.